Good evening. Thank you, everybody, for coming out in the rain. We're supposed to have clear weather today. I don't know who screwed that up. My name is Kent Katner. I'm a public programs manager at the Zuckerman Institute. I want to thank everybody for coming. And before we begin, I'd like to get just a show of hands. How many of you are here, are attending a Music on the Brain event for the first time? All right, great. How many of you are here at the National Jazz Museum for the first time? Fantastic, fantastic. We love to see new faces. And I would like to give a big thanks to the National Jazz Museum, and particularly Ryan Maloney and Elijah back there for helping us out. I think we've been working together since 2019. The National Jazz Museum has been supporting this program, Music on the Brain. I'd also like to give a thanks to Will Glass at the Jazz Foundation of America, who also has begun supporting this program. We're very happy to be here. Normally, we're going to do things a little bit different this evening. So I'd like to just introduce really quickly our musicians. We have for the first time with us, Yayoi Ikawa. Hope I pronounced that correctly. Thank you. Jazz pianist and composer, right? TK Blue. What can I say about TK Blue? Multi-instrumentalist, composer, world traveler, music educator. His new album, and let's make sure I remember the name correctly. And of course I'm not wearing my glasses, so that doesn't help very much, but The Tide of Love reached number 11 on the jazz charts. That's fantastic. And as I said, we're changing things up a little bit. Normally we would begin with music, but what we're going to do instead is introduce our scientist right away. And a little later in the program, TK is going to explain why we decided to change things around. So for this, I need to put my glasses on. So let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Thiago Arzua. He is a neuroscientist with the Marlin Lab at Columbia University's Zuckerman Institute. He currently studies how traumatic experiences are passed down through multiple generations. His research program will inform us how our brains encode traumatic experiences with specific implications for the effects of traumatic experiences early in life, like suffering abuse or neglect from a parent, as well as broader implications for the treatment of anxiety in children and adults that may originate from ancestral trauma and stress. Okay? So I'm going to hand over to TK, and we'll begin with the dialogue, and we'll begin. Yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.
All right. Can everybody hear me okay? Oh, okay, good. Thiago, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, and how did you end up at the Zuckerman Institute, and what do you mean by intergenerational trauma?
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming tonight. I am Thiago. I was born and raised in Brazil. Somehow ended up in Florida for college, and then Wisconsin for grad school, which was even worse. But found my way to New York City, where I feel like I finally belong somewhere. Intergenerational trauma, to me, I always somewhat compared to the movie Encanto. If you haven't seen that, you've probably seen Everything Everywhere All at Once. It seems to be something that everyone has been thinking about constantly. At the Marlin Lab where I work, we are also lucky to always do these kinds of events, always interact with artists. The picture behind me is from Ana Cristina Vallejo, who's a Colombian photographer, mixed media artist who did a lot of photography inspired by our work as well. And as I mentioned, it does seem that we're thinking more about these things now. I see this graph and I think of job security, but it looks like we're always trying to understand more of how intergenerational trauma happens, how things that happen maybe 50, 60, 200 years ago can still impact us. Unfortunately, the human evidence for this, or the human studies that we have for this, are always linked to horrible things, such as the Dutch hunger winter, or the Dutch famine. So this happened in So this happened in 1945 when Nazi Germany cut basically the Netherlands in half and starved the northern part. Down there you can see what people were allowed to eat. They were allowed to eat maybe 1,000 calories a day. The reason I say this is where evidence starts to get as far as like intergenerational trauma is they kept really good records. So now that we are almost 3 generations down, we see that the people who survived the Dutch hunger winter and who then had kids and had grandkids and now are having grandkids, that offspring, that progeny now has higher risk of diabetes, higher risk of other metabolic diseases, weirdly enough, higher risk of schizophrenia, and we don't really know why. We do know it is tied to epigenetics. Like many other things, I like to think about epigenetics as far as food goes. The main analogy that I have is if you think of your body and if you think of DNA as a giant recipe book that can make anything you want, you can make hair cells, you can make nails, you can make liver, you can make brain. But if you have a good recipe book, you know it's not like this. It's full of notes. If you take anything from this, epigenetics really are just the notes on top of the cookbook of life. It's the notes that says a little more of this, a little more of that, a little less of this. The reason we know it's epigenetics is it's basically how we understand evolution. So if you remember from Biology 101 or if you remember from high school, we understand evolution as these little breaks in DNA. So these little breaks in that book of life that cause a mutation over and over again, and then we get here. Epigenetics kind of throws that out of the window a little bit, which, don't know what happened. Oh, there you go. Throws that out of the window a little bit. And it's part of why my research is kind of controversial, if you will. I once presented this and heard from a geneticist, I don't believe in any of the work that you do. Because we understand evolution like that, and when we think of a human development, and most animals for that matter, we have 2 giant erasers that should completely erase any epigenetic information. We'll go into the science more a little bit later, and I'm happy to talk afterwards as well. But I think if you remember evolution, if you ever heard about evolution as far as giraffes go, there's one theory called Lamarckism, which every now and then is taught as the giraffes stretched their necks, and that's why they got taller. And then we learned that that is the wrong way of thinking. It's only because of natural selection, and it's only because of how the environment changes. I think Lamarck was talking more about the environment itself changing. So if you think more about this, and as we go through the show, think more about like how the environment can change how you behave, how you act. The giraffes were not just stretching their necks, their environment was changing. In the case of humans, the only evidence that we have is mixed. These are a few different studies. The first 2 also relate back to the Dutch hunger winter. If you take any from this, the Holocaust is correlated with some increased risk for PTSD. Dutch hunger winter has mixed results as far as like whether your grandfather or your maternal grandmother have survived starvation. All of this in humans is messy. It's really hard to isolate individual things, and it's why we need to do these research in other models. Most of the time, all we know is like greater risk of this or lesser risk of this. And almost as a segue to the next part of the show, I was recently at the Smithsonian Museum of National African American History. One of the things that really caught my attention were photographs. This country has a tendency of thinking of slavery as something that happened 500 years ago, that happened 300 years ago. There were photographs at the time. So this is near Alexandria, Virginia. It is 1861. Some of these things that happened, yes, it started maybe like 350 years ago, but some of these things are still with us, whether we like it or not. I just want to get this in the mood for the next part of the show. TK.
Our environment definitely can have an impact on our brain and can change the makeup of our brain. And these changes can be passed down to our children. I'm wondering, does anybody in the audience, would anybody have any questions that you would like to ask before we go on with some music and also talk about that? Any questions for Thiago, any of his research?
How does it relate to the music?
Say again?
How does it relate to the music?
You want to wait for the music. Okay. So what we're going to do, we're going to do something a little different in terms of, you know, with the recent age that we're in now, of technology, it's a lot different from how, in terms of appreciating music, listening to music, it's a lot different than it was when I was a teenager and growing up in Long Island. For example, growing up, you know, when we would purchase an album, an LP, we listen to the whole LP because it's not very easy to skip around on an LP for different tracks. So we listen to the whole LP, and normally the artists, when they record an LP, they're telling a story, they're painting a picture. It's a complete work from the beginning to the end, sequentially. Today, we're more in, because of technology with the MP3s and online and tracks, you know, we listen to singles. Even when artists release new music today, they don't release a whole CD. You know, I have a new CD out, but it was released over the course of 7 months. One single here, the next month another single. So it becomes kind of difficult to convey a total story through the entire body of work. So what I would like to do for you all is I'm going to play a suite, excerpts from a suite that I composed in 2006, and it's the suite is called "Follow the North Star," and it's dedicated to the life of Solomon Northup and his memoir, 12 Years a Slave. I'm just going to play some excerpts, and after we can talk about it, and you all can tell me if you were able to visualize anything within the different parts of the music. Did it tell a story to you, et cetera, et cetera. So let's see let's try it and see where we go. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Please, let's have a big hand for Yayoi Ikawa on the piano. Thank you, and I'll be interested to hear any comments about anything. Yes.
I have a question. Relating the trauma to epigenerations, is there trauma in the music that when you create like a dissonance and then come out of it and it feels
When we just played just now, did you hear any trauma in any of the things we played?
well, the tension at the end of the song, you were just jamming along and then the piano came out and
Yeah.
because it was just so happy
There definitely can be trauma in music, no doubt. And in fact, musicians, we are reflections of society. So, most often when we play, we give a picture of what's going on. It's like when you listen to, for example, you listen to the music of the 60s in jazz, what they call the free jazz or avant-garde. Think about what was happening in the 60s. We had the riots, we had assassinations of major people, the Kennedys, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King. There was a lot of upheaval, a lot of unrest, and that came out in the music. So yeah, I think that definitely there can be trauma in music, and
past the trauma and start something beautiful again.
yeah. Well, we tried to paint a picture. I'm just curious if anybody could tell anything about what we just played. Did it paint a picture? Did it tell a story? Yes. Could you stand up so we can hear you? Yeah.
Did the first song reflect a sort of journey like the underground railroad, sort of like the escape?
Can we? Do we have the mic? We can give. Yeah, Kent, could you give the mic to the people who want to ask questions? It'd be better for that we can really hear everything. Yeah, let's do the mic. Then you can. Yeah, great. Okay.
Hello. Was the first song? It reminded me, or it felt like the journey like through the underground railroad, sort of like the escape from. So you said it was like about the story of the person.
The first song I started with the African kalimba.
Oh.
This instrument.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So it felt like that's what it sounded like to me.
Yeah. So yeah, that for me kind of represents the ancestors. That part of the movement, in fact, is called Ancestral Callings, because the kalimba is an African instrument, and most often there are different names for this instrument. This one is called kalimba. You have some that are called imbira, some are called sanza, lukembe, bongo. These are different names, and quite often in Africa, the gentlemen or ladies who play these instruments are known as the jolly or griot. They're the oral historians, and they have all of the information of their area by memory. They know it, and they pass it down to generation to generation. So that was the first song, and then we went on from there. What about any of the subsequent songs? I was wondering if anybody got some, yeah.
First of all, thank you so much. Beautiful, beautiful music. I heard some despair early on, and I heard optimism, and then I heard joy and excitement at the end.
Wow.
And I also heard Pharoah Sanders all throughout.
Uh-oh.
So.
It's one of my heroes. Yeah. Any other? You got somebody? Yeah?
Yeah, thank you so much. I did hear a lot of cyclical rhythms in the beginning and a lot of like repetition of themes and like a lot of like cyclical rhythms, and then I heard more of like a switching into like, I'm getting a little technical, sorry, but like a more like a 2/4 what was happening and kind of how music developed over time. There was also one song, it was one of the first ones where you picked up the sax, but it sounded like we were in a park and I was seeing like Central Park at night, and then the next one was like waking up for breakfast. So I heard a lot of, and I feel like it related to what I heard before that, which was a lot of, like you said, despair, but also like it was a little bit more held back and like an uncertainty, and I heard a lot of hope and passion and joy and pushing forward. Okay. That's what I heard.
Okay, very good observation. Let's take one more, then I want to ask Thiago.
TK, by the way, this is Sarah Bennett.
Say again?
This is Sarah.
Oh, okay.
This is Sarah.
Great. Any other? Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to say it sounded like the first one sounded just like a journey. I felt it from the beginning.
Okay.
I felt the despair, the mourn, and the tribulation at the same time,
Right.
but still going back. You know, I saw where they was coming from and where they went.
Right, that's a very good observation. Yeah, this suite is called "Follow the North Star." You know, there's a lot of movements we couldn't play because of time, but it starts off with the one I started with, "Ancestral Callings," and then we go to a song called "Valley of Paradise" because Solomon Northup lived in Saratoga Springs. He was a violinist. He had a family. He was a free black man during the time of slavery, and he was quite well off. He had a beautiful home, beautiful family, and he lived in Saratoga. The third movement is called a Song for Solomon, beautiful ballad. Then after that, we played it here. It sounded like a blues, but a very slow blues. That one's called The Capture, because he got captured. He went to Washington, D.C. to perform, and after the show, they put, the guys that invited him put some knockout stuff in his drink, and he drank it and he knocked out. When he woke up, he was in chains in a basement in Washington, D.C., where he was later transported to Louisiana. That was the next song called Southern Rendezvous. And then he got to Louisiana. Then the song we went into when I played kind of frantic, things like that, that was called Valley of Despair. Because, you know, and but interesting thing, which they didn't point out in the movie, that I know from reading the book, and I know from being a musician, that music gives you hope. And Solomon expressed several times in the book, had he not played the violin, he would have given up all hope. But because he could play the violin, when he would feel despair, he would play, and the somber tones of the violin would give him hope. That's the Mississippi Delta blues. That's how the blues was born in this country. You know, it was born out of a struggle, but it gives people, when you sing the blues, it gives you hope. It gives you a chance to get out some of the anguish, some of the stuff that's inside, and it gives you, you know, you feel better after you know, this is how we have the blues in our country. And then from there we went to Free to Be Me, because now he's free. So that was the more New Orleans upbeat second line tune, and then from there we go to Follow the North Star, which is a funk piece. We could play the excerpt of that maybe before if we have time, and then we end with the Township Diary, because that's when he wrote his memoirs, The 12 Years a Slave. And I don't know if some of you have seen the movie. It came out in 2010, and it won the Oscar for Best Picture that year. When it was being filmed, some friends of mine knew some of the people, and they tried to get some of my music in the movie, which would have been great. I would have become famous and rich and moved to Hollywood, and you know. But it's okay. I'm glad it didn't happen, because then I wouldn't be here today to be with you all. So, you know, I'd rather be here today. But let's try to tie this in with epigenetics, because I'm very fascinated with this field and how, you know, is when we did some Zoom together with Kent and with Thiago, and for example, he was showing us a mouse that had opportunity to smell different odors, like, you know, peanut or walnut. But anytime the mouse went into this compartment to smell an almond odor, it got a shock. And then the offspring of these mice would never go towards the almond. You know, so very interesting. Maybe you could expound more on that, Thiago.
That was amazing. Yes, so at the Marlin Lab, it would be very frowned upon if we started famines and wars, but we do want to learn how adaptations in parents can influence the development of offspring. We don't use all of these animals, we only use mice, but these are the three main, like, if you're ever curious how people are studying these things, there's a handful of labs in the country doing it, and they mostly use fruit flies, worms, or mice. In my opinion, mice are about the best we can do. Very happy that I've never underwent like horrible trauma, but I did mention from the beginning that I'm from Brazil, and I think the most stressful situation that I face is looking at the sign every time I have to come back to this country. If you're not from here, this is the immigration that people face when they have to come, when they fly in, when they get into a boat. When that happens, you might have seen some of these things before. This is like your adrenaline response. Usually I'm not that happy, but I'll get my pupils dilated, you get no salivation, your heart rate increases, your tummy feels funny. All of those things we relate to adrenaline. In your brain, though, we have something called noradrenaline. It is doing very similar stuff. It's basically preparing you for something. It's preparing you for a shift in your environment. Weirdly enough, all of that, let me see if I can, all of that is produced in this tiny little thing. It's about 1 millimeter in humans. It's even smaller in mice, called the locus coeruleus, which is just Latin for the blue spot. I mentioned that we study these things in mice. This is a lovely mouse. Thank God they're not that big. But the way we study these things is, as TK mentioned, we expose them to certain cues. So we expose them to smells, we expose them to audio, we can even expose them to like certain visual stimuli, and we then pair that with a shock. It's a very mild foot shock. If you ever got pranked on one of those books or one of those like little gun things, it's more of a startle than a shock. Does not injure them at all. But because we take advantage of their olfactory system, we use that as a tool to kind of mimic what we think a stressful experience will be. Very much like humans, mice have every cell that smells something different. So a cell that smells almonds, a cell that smells grass, a cell that smells anything. Each one of those is different. So we can use that anatomy in our favor as well. And this is just a little cartoon of what that looks like inside their brains. The other thing that we do that's a little bit different than what would have happened in humans, we do these things in all of our mice. Even our control groups also get a shock and also get exposed to smell. What we're testing here, so basically our control will have that separate by a time lock. So basically they'll get exposed to the smell, almonds comes in the room, and then later on they'll get a shock. And then they never learn to dissociate, or they never learn to associate those two. Whereas if those are two linked together, we get something called coincidence detection. This is when the mouse learns, okay, this odor is gonna cause a shock. This is what they look like afterwards. If you've never seen videos of mice, they're very tiny, they are also very fast, but this is a sped up video, that's not how fast they are. Mice are very curious, they usually just run around, zoom around. So this is a mouse that was exposed to the shock, or exposed to the odor, and then shocked later on, so it never learned to fear a certain smell. In the case, the smell is in this side of the chamber. But the other one, because it got basically learned or got association with that smell, sorry, I think the odor is in this side, my bad. It never even goes in there. This is not the shock, this is not where they got shocked, so this is a new environment, but because they know that cue, they know that that might cause a shock, they never go in there. I mentioned the anatomy of the olfactory system. Don't worry too much about all the science behind this. What's cool about this is that we can then isolate each one of these cells, or we can isolate the tissue where those cells are, and use this very fancy technique. We're a very fancy lab in general, where we clear all the tissue away, and we basically make this transparent, and we're able to count individual cells in there. So this is a mouse olfactory system, and then we use something called a light sheet microscope here, and then we can then go and count each one of those cells. One of the coolest things that our lab has done so far, and we are only 3 years old, we can count those cells. I don't know if it's gonna be very easy to see here, but when we go and see like, okay, how many almond cells, how many cells that respond to the smell of almond, does a mouse that got shocked and learned to fear that smell has compared to the unpaired, and this is the only scientific graph I'll show, that have more. So can't really say that they're more sensitive to it, but there's an anatomical difference. They basically change the way their system of olfaction works because of that experience, because of that stressful experience. And then, of course, the wow moment. Everyone say, yeah, wow. This is inherited. Basically, the anatomy of the offspring of those mice. So mice that were never exposed to the smell, mice that never got shocked, mice that basically are just out and about, they have more of those cells as well. What does it mean? We don't know. We are still figuring out. That's what I did the whole day today. So in general, we have basically this little nugget of finding where we have a system, we have a model. My little piece inside of this is how, back to noradrenaline, how noradrenaline and all the system of noradrenaline influences this. I mentioned we're fancy. What I've done so far is use the same technology, the same clearing technology, this time looking at the locus coeruleus. I'm sorry, I know it's called the blue spot, but this one's in red. But we can also go inside that brain region and then basically look into it and see how it's going to change. So catch me in like 3 years when I try to figure out what's happening, but hopefully we'll be able to see exactly like what morphological changes are happening, how this stress is being represented in the brain, how the brain is modulating that change in cell number that we see in the olfactory system. And just to wrap this up real quick, we are in a very weird city. We are in a very weird environment. I think one of the things I always try to remind myself is that we were built to be, I don't know, like in the savannas, like we were built to be somewhere else. Our environment is not necessarily made for us. I think part of the research that we do is not necessarily just dwell on the past or dwell on the horrible things that happen. To go back to your point about hope, I think our research is much more about the potential that we have, much more about how these things can affect us, sure, but how much plastic we are, how much we can like change our environment as well. So, yeah.
Anybody have any questions for Thiago?
Hi, thank you for making something very complicated sort of understandable. But my question is, so this what we saw represents chronic stress. Because I guess my question is like, does it build over time, and then is it cemented, or can it be reversed?
That's a great question. It can be reversed. That was a paper that came out only a year or two ago. It is something that can be reversed. The way, weirdly enough, the way that it reverses is if you ever heard of exposure therapy. It's basically what they do to mice. You show them the smell over and over again without any shocks. They'll go like, okay, fine. And then all the anatomic changes reverse, their behavior changes, and then they don't pass that down, which is fascinating. It is more of an acute stress. It takes us 3 days. In the grand scheme of things, it's more acute. There are some labs right around here, like in Mount Sinai, who study chronic social defeat. That goes for like 3-6 months. That does also leave like a horrible impression, and it's also inherited. But yeah, it's weirdly enough, like it's a very acute, it's a very specific thing, and somehow it still gets inherited. So it's part of why we know it's epigenetics, but also why we think this is so fascinating, because it's a very specific change in over 3 days.
I relate to it in the fact that in families often they suffer from, if their father was an alcoholic, the grandfather was an alcoholic, and now the son is an alcoholic. And if somebody's father beat them, they're more likely to beat their son. Is that really what we're talking about here, or is it more behavior? I don't know.
We don't know either. Part of this research, I think not necessarily just the research, but part of our job is just to say that this has a biological component. When we isolate these mice, when we do in vitro fertilization, when we basically take away any kind of behavior, any kind of cultural, if you will, aspect of this, it's still there. So there's still a biological component to this. There's still something there's some piece of information that is getting inherited. That's our job. Our job is to deal with the biology. I do think my advisor and my boss is married to a Jewish man, and she often jokes that like, have you seen his family? And I think it makes sense. Like in humans, it's much more complicated. In humans, it's much more nuanced, and I think it's just very difficult to study. So we are working on the biology. We're working on like as isolated as we can be. There's no way to do that in humans. There's no way to say like, oh, you're gonna have offspring, but you're not gonna take care of them. You're not gonna be and then they're gonna be okay. I think what we're doing is mostly just saying like, this has a biological component. This exists in science. All the behavior and all the other things we cannot control, but it's real. It exists.
Hey, thank you. Super interesting talk. I'm curious whether or not you see the same increase in like the olfactory neurons with like maybe positive stimuli, and whether or not like the offspring of your experimental mice, like whether or not almonds have just increased saliency, or is it like increased like negative valence?
The answer that I always give is that no one will fund that research, unfortunately. No, we haven't looked at yet. We do have a collaborator who studies pleasurable touch in mice. But pleasurable touch, so they just like gently push like I think a feather. It basically cuddles the mouse. We are working on that. It'll be like like physically and pragmatically a little bit more challenging. I think the more take away all the trauma and take all the stress, I think one of the most fascinating things to me is that there is information being passed down. There is something that goes against all we understand about evolution, that goes against all we understand of like how biology should work. It's still present, it's still happening. There's nothing that tells me that a positive experience is gonna be passed down. I don't know in what sense, but yeah, it makes perfect sense.
Thank you. I'm in that pleasurable touch lab.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, I don't know if this has any kind of similarity, but one thing I just thought about in this discussion and the questions that were asked is, there's a gentleman that I had the opportunity to work with quite a bit named Dr. Randy Weston. He passed away September 1st of 2018 at the age of 92. He was born April 6, 1926, so he came up in an era of acute discrimination and segregation. He had to sit in the top of the movie theater, things like that. When they traveled, when he was starting to tour in the South, he couldn't stay at hotels. He had to stay like the Green Book, he had to find out where African Americans could stay and all that. Now, his father told him when he was quite young that, son, you got to find out about your history, because you don't just come from slaves. You come from rich kingdoms. You have to go back before slavery. You got to find out about the Ghanaian empires, about Kush, about Dahomey, about the great temples, about the great universities in Fez, in Alexandria, in Timbuktu. You have to study this. Then you will have a different sense of worth and self-esteem. So, which he did. He was on a mission. And he started studying these things. And he started finding out some of the greatness of things that happened in Africa, things that he was not taught in school. And as a result, his son, for example, who I knew very well, he was a prodigy. He came up. He was playing the hand drums. In a couple of months, he went to Africa. He spoke several languages. He could paint. He could draw. He was definitely not African American who walked with his head down, ashamed of his roots, ashamed of his heritage. So I think that there's some things that happen in our environment that can help shape our prodigy, shape the folks that come after us in terms of how we view ourselves, how we view our self-worth. Because, Dr. Weston was on a mission to elevate African American culture and elevate the Pan-African culture. Because so often, even today in the news, when we hear things about Africa, it's usually 99% of the time something negative. Either it's famine, coup, destruction, fighting, war. We don't hear of the beautiful things that happened in Africa. I spent a lot of time in Africa, and I can tell you there's so much beauty. I've been in situations where I meet people for the first time, and then I'm at their home having food. It's a privilege for them to share their food. I met a guy in the street who had on a beautiful African shirt, and I made a comment. I rolled the window down and said, "Sir, mon ami," I spoke to him in French. "Mon ami, j'aime beaucoup ta chemise. C'est très joli. I like your shirt. It's very beautiful." He asked me, "Where are you from?" And I said, "I'm from New York." He said, "Ah, tu es mon frère." He says, "You're my brother." He took the shirt off and threw it in the car. As I took, I still have this shirt at home. I never wear it. It's a token of love and of friendship. So all that to say that I think somewhere along the line, in conjunction with the research that Thiago's doing, I think that there's a way that we can pass down these kind of things to our offspring that change our lives and impact our lives as we've seen. So that's just one observation. And we have time for another question, and then we're going to close out with some music. One more question?
In terms of what he's talking about, biology, it's more of the psychology and the sociology of it all, which determines what the next generation does. Because like he was saying, he went to Africa, he changed his whole mindset. So it starts up here as to what you send forth to your next offsprings or the next generation. So that's where the biology is all got to be up here. It's all connected. I don't think it's separate, especially in society today.
Gotcha.
That's just a
Beautiful observation. We're going to close out with, we're going to play for you Follow the North Star, because, Solomon, as I mentioned, was from Saratoga up north. He was enslaved in Louisiana, so once he got free, he jetted back up north. So we're going to play, and we're going to go right into Township Diary, which is when he got back home, he wrote his memoir, and that's what became the book 12 Years a Slave. Thank you very much. Another big hand for Yayoi Ikawa. And our PhD, Thiago, please. And a special thanks to Kent Cantor for organizing. And I don't know if there was a last question or anything. If not, you want to say something, Ken? Do you have any other observation or anything would anybody like to share? And if not, I do want to mention, in case anybody still deals with dinosaurs, I have some CDs available. And so I know most people don't even have CD players, but every now and then, you know, I have an old Volvo 2010. I still have a CD player. I'm so happy. So I can still listen to CDs in my car. But we do have some available, and thank you so much. Again, Miss Yayoi Ikawa on the piano. Yours truly, TK Blue, and we'll be back in October, right?
October 26th.
All right, we'll be back with another session of the music and the brain. So God bless you all.
TK Blue, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for coming out. I would like to ask a favor of everyone. In the back towards the entrance, we have a QR code with a very brief, I promise, survey. So if everybody would just scan and answer our feedback survey so that we can make this program even better. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, TK.